Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rumi Forum. We're very happy to have with us here today Professor James Witte of George Mason University. He is Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Center for Social Science Research at George Mason. Professor Witte earned his PhD from Harvard in 1991. He has been a professor at Clemson University and Northwestern University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Carolina Population Center and a lecturer in sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Witte's ongoing research focuses on ways to use the World Wide Web to collect survey and data, the similarities and differences between online and offline societies, and the economic contributions of U.S. immigrants. Please welcome Professor James Witte.
Thank you, thank you. So it's good to be here, and thank you for coming, and thank you for the invitation for a chance to talk a little bit about a new research project that we have going on at George Mason. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the new Institute for Immigration Research, the IIR, and some of our preliminary findings, data analyses that we've been doing since we got started about June of last year. The Institute for Immigration Research is originally at George Mason. There was something called the Mason Project on Immigration. And this was started at the initiative of the provost about 10 years ago, and was looking at a variety of local immigrant issues, particularly changes in the way immigrants were treated by municipal and county law. And when I arrived at Mason about 4 years ago, the project had kind of stalled out. People were not working as actively on it as they had in the past, and the dean and I decided we would kind of put it on hiatus for a while, and until we sort of got things moving again at the Center for Social Science Research. And it got moving very quickly last fall when Diane Portnoy, who is an entrepreneur, well, sort of, she runs a language school in Malden, Massachusetts. But the interesting thing about Diane is she is herself an immigrant. She came to Massachusetts through Ellis Island in 1947 and has become very, very successful. And in 1992, she set up a language school that provides free language instruction at this point now in its 20th year to hundreds of newly arrived immigrants. And she does it all with her own fundraising. It's a 4-story building. You know, it's fantastic. And their web address is here on the site if you want to take a look, the Immigrant Learning Center. But anyway, so Diane came to Mason and said she had been funding some small-scale local research in the Boston area and would like to invest some of her money in a larger project in a DC-based university, and particularly at George Mason. And we talked a little bit and agreed we would do it, and got going, as I said, last summer. And I will put in a little plug for George Mason as well. It's a very exciting time at George Mason. We have a new president, yes. Angel Cabrera, and Angel is an immigrant. He's from Spain, and so he's very interested in immigration issues and in the issue of entrepreneurship. So the connection with the IIR is fantastic, and he actually went to visit with Diane at an event last month to celebrate the 20th anniversary. So we see a lot of support from the university in this project as well. The mission statement, which we worked on hard and long, is our mission is to refocus the immigration conversation among academics, policymakers, and the public by producing and disseminating unbiased and objective interdisciplinary academic research related to immigrants and immigration in the United States. And I think the refocusing are the two real important parts there. The refocusing is going to happen in two ways. That as I began to look over what's going on in immigration research, It's very much been focused on specific groups, the largest group, the Mexican Hispanic groups, and it has also primarily focused on integration, questions of how we facilitate the arrival of new immigrants, how we handle issues that happen when new immigrants and the native-born are living side by side. And as we looked at that, and through discussion with Diane, and Diane said, you know, she wants the Institute to focus on the economic contributions of immigrants. You know, she said those problems are real, you know, and she's lived them. And she's helping people with the process of integration. But she said there's a part of America that needs to know and to understand the way immigrants are making this positive economic contribution. And so that's what she's charged us to do, which makes it a great task. You know, and the other part is this range of immigrant groups. You know, that we're going to be speaking in our research to 3 audiences. That's what's laid out in the mission statement there, to academics, policymakers, and the public. And to really get people to think about immigrants in America, it's a rainbow. You know, there is a very large Mexican immigrant population, but there's a diversity there that we need to understand and see how they're fitting into the U.S. economy and what kind of contributions the different groups are making. So we're getting going, and what I'd like to do to begin with, you know, toward the end I'm going to ask you for some input and some of the topics that we may be missing. You know, what should we be looking at in the future? What are some important, you know, as we're building our research agenda, to get some input from folks here, you know, either today or send me an email about some ideas of ways that we could enrich this research program. But the areas we're starting out with is a mapping of immigrant entrepreneurs and immigrant employees. We're going to be looking at immigrant workers in selected industries. We've got a kind of fun but important project on immigrant Nobel Prize winners. And then we'll talk a little bit about some election poll results that we did that I think really highlight, though there seems to be a shift in the rhetoric of the parties right now. And I happen to be a resident of South Carolina, and I'm very proud of my senator, Lindsey Graham, who has come out and said he's with Senator Schumer. They're going to be the two leading a big push for immigration reform.
Right.
You know, and I think that's going to be an important time. But one of the things we'll see in our election results is, in this case, the leaders may be out in front of the public. So we're going to take a look at that a little bit. But now the mapping, you know, when we talk about mapping immigrant entrepreneurs, part of it is, you know, a visualization tool. You know, and we've got some maps here that we can look at. But it's a visualization tool that we're going to use in several ways, because we're going to look at immigrants where they're located geographically, but also where they're located in terms of industries and occupations. And then finally, where did they come from?
And I just want to, for the viewing audience purpose, can this be found on the website?
Yes.
Okay.
These maps are on our website, and they're organized. We have a great new website it's getting better every day, and that is iir.gmu.edu.
Super.
And there on the research tab, you can see each of these areas that I'm going to talk about, and some of the slides are there as well. So the visualization through mapping, you know, this is, I said it's an exciting time to be at George Mason. I think it's an exciting time to be a social scientist, because we've got a whole bunch of new tools and new data that used to be in non-digital form is now digital. And we're able to use that for a variety of research purposes and questions. And so what you'll see when you look at the maps is I've presented a subset of them. The first one looks at the percent distribution of immigrants in the workforce. The darker the shading, the greater the proportion of immigrants there in that particular state. And there's no big surprises in this first map. It's a little bit what you would expect. It's a sort of coarse-grained analysis, you know, because if you look at the second map, where, and this is data that comes from the American Community Survey, which was put together by the U.S. Bureau of the Census. It's, instead of 50 states, what we map there are over 2,000 geographic areas known as PUMAs, which is a public use micro data area. And so a PUMA allows us to look at, in a more fine-tuned way, where people are. So it really reflects better the way that local labor markets are organized. So you can see clustering, it's not in, if you look at the first map and you see all of Texas is dark, okay? But then when you go look at the PUMA, where we've disaggregated and we look specifically at areas, you see along the southern border, that's where a lot of the immigrants are concentrated. And we see that in a variety of the different states here. And the first interpretation people might have is that the second map is better. And what we're trying to say is it's just a different view. And that's part of the power of GIS, Geographical Information Systems, is you can take different views on data. And this first map at the state level is important more for political communication than actually our detailed analysis. And if you look at the next map where we say it's at the state level, the percent distribution of the self-employed among immigrants in workers in the U.S. states. Okay, so this is, the denominator now is the immigrant workforce, and the numerator is how many of them are self-employed. And as you look at that map, there's one real big surprise that strikes me, and that's the great state of Montana. Okay, not dark blue. I mean, it is dark blue. It's not a big state in terms of population. It doesn't have a lot of immigrants, but a large share of those immigrants are self-employed. And you look at another state like California, it's also dark blue. Okay, it's got many more immigrants. A lot of them are self-employed. But there's something in that Montana and California have in common. They both have 2 senators. Okay, so that those 2 senators can be people that we can talk to and say, do you realize, in our communication with policymakers and talking to their staff, do you realize that there are a large proportion of the immigrants in your state are self-employed? And the self-employment we use as sort of a proxy for entrepreneur. The census data is great. These maps are based on 15 million observations. It's a big data set with a lot of detail.
Can we just back up for just 1 second? How are we defining immigrant?
How are we defining? It's a good question. We're defining an immigrant as someone who is born in another country and not born of U.S. parents.
Okay.
All right. And yeah, so anytime, jump away and ask questions. Okay. Sort of,
no problem.
I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and sometimes realize other people haven't been, or at least not in the way I think about it. Yeah. So the immigrants are native, are non-native born. All right, and then the Census Bureau asks them about their naturalization status. Okay. Okay, so we do know if they're citizens, if they're naturalized citizens, or if they're non-citizens, and that's it. Okay. Okay, at that level of detail. All right, so these state-level maps, and we're going to be working on some maps based on congressional districts as well, are a way that we're thinking about reaching out to policymakers.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this first map, which kind of looks like that. Politically speaking, thinking the first map would be more important, but as we are aware, even if we were following the election that just took place, the focus on the counties with the most population. And then looking at counties, especially where Florida was concerned. Looking at counties that had a large amount of immigrants. Yeah. So, I mean. Anyway,
it's for political purposes, and one of the interesting things about the world of social science research right now is some of the most dynamic and exciting things are happening off the university campus. That they're happening in some places that have a lot more freedom and are doing some pretty innovative stuff with digital data. And we're working to collaborate with them and catch up with them. I've been very interested in digital data for a while, so I'm thrilled to see others are starting to understand why I'm interested in the internet, for example. A lot of sociologists didn't get that for a long time, but certainly after this election, they should get it. So this sort of mapping is one thing we're doing. I've given you a couple results here where I've broken out the immigrants according to particular countries. And what you look there, again, one of the issues we see is that as people talk about immigrants in the United States, where the non-native born is currently 16% of the adult population, and of that group, 30% are from one country, Mexico. And so that's coloring our perceptions.
Sure.
But then when we look at educational attainment, and here we compare Iranians, Iraqis, Turks, and Mexicans, there's a big difference.
Big.
Yeah. Roughly a quarter of those from Iran and Turkey who are adults living in the United States have a graduate degree.
Exactly.
Huge
number.
And surprisingly, the Iraqis and the U.S. born are closer to the Mexicans in terms of graduate degree attainment than they are to those from Turkey or from Iran.
And yet we know that in Iraq, how educated folks were there. I'm not aware of the current situation, but prior to the Iraq War and the most recent one, and even the Gulf War, we had women engineers at the highest levels in many countries in the world, and so so where are they? They're not here.
Well, and I
in
think
this
part
country,
of it, they're somewhere else. They're not in this country, and we do have a lot of political refugees, and a number of them have lower levels of education.
Right.
Among the Iraqi group. So we look at that there. Among education, we see real difference, sort of variation within the immigrant groups. The same thing with employment status, where again the rates of self-employment for Iran, Iraq, and Turkey are actually much higher than those for the Mexican and the native-born population. And again, we focus on the self-employed as again a proxy for entrepreneurship, because one of the things that we want to think about is, and we can't get it from this data set, we can't get it from the American Community Survey, we're going to have to get some other data that we're working on, but that people who are self-employed create jobs. They create jobs that go perhaps to immigrants, but also to the native born. And so the sort of rhetoric that we often hear about taking our jobs, a lot of immigrants are job creators.
I think this is where we have failed to make the argument for why it is important and why it's, why it has been so important to the formation of our country, the immigrant situation. Yeah. How immigrants have contributed. We've failed to make this argument. In my opinion, I'm very hopeful for this institution. And so when I saw the beginning of this handout, I'm very happy to hear about and to learn about the institution that's been founded because.
Yeah, and there are other places, and importantly, there's great work being done at other places as well, and we're trying to pull some of that together about the way that immigrants are creating jobs. And one of the limitations is that often those other studies focus on a particular industry. And we're trying to say, what's the combined
I'm
impact?
sorry, I don't think we have failed to distribute that information. I think when I say that, I don't mean that it's not, the information isn't there. It's there, but we've failed to get it to the eyes and ears of the general public.
Right. And I think that's going to be one, and this is why we're focusing on these three audiences of the general public, policymakers, and academics. all too often academics talk to themselves and write for one another rather than the public. And at George Mason, in our sociology program, we have a fairly new PhD program, and it's a PhD program in public and applied sociology, to really sort of say, how can we use the insights of sociology to inform public debate and public opinion?
And it's also who believes that that's important. I mean, we have a cable news media and regular news media and journalism in general and whatnot that, disseminating these which is one outlet to disseminate the information, but it's one of the biggest. And so, they need to decide whether or not this is important for the public to know as well. The information might be there, but will they use it and distribute it?
Yeah, and that's what we've got to try to work on, is getting some of the information out there. And that's a nice segue into the next area where we've been doing some work, which is on Nobel Prize winners. We're planning on putting this out publicly in a big way right around the Nobel Prize awarding ceremony to perhaps catch people's attention. This one, you go to the website, this looks really great in color. And it's a very simple portrayal of a series of bar charts that show for each decade the proportion of Nobel Prize winners who were American. And it's a big chunk. It's well over half by now.
Yes.
All right, so if you look at it online, you'll see green. Green is the share that belongs to people who are not American, and gold is the group that is American. But then we've got a next slide where we say, all right, let's look at where those American Nobel Prize winners were born. And a good chunk of them were born not in the United States. That the majority of Nobel Prize winners would not be American were it not for the immigrants. And then the third slide there shows, and it's not just one immigrant group. They're coming from all over. That we're getting a diversity of the top achievements in science, in the arts, in literature, and in the Peace Prize. That those are people who are coming from a variety of different countries and are part of America right now. And so if people are sort of cheering the way America's winning Nobel Prizes, they should be cheering their immigrants as well, because they're making a major contribution to that. We'll talk a little bit about some election results. We did, working with the University of Virginia at their Survey Research Center, we put together a collaborative effort in October to do a statewide election poll. And we did 600 telephone surveys. As with most people, it was too close to call. And now the election's already over, so we know who won. But the more important thing, and we knew that we, as a one-off poll, that we weren't going to get a lot of attention for the state of Virginia, whether we could decide who was going to win or not. So instead, we wanted to focus on some issues and to sort of say, let's think about the people who have an expressed preference for Barack Obama and the people who have an expressed preference for Mitt Romney, and where do they stand on issues? And particularly, we looked at issues related to immigration. Before we go into the immigration, I will say, across the board, what we found is though the results of the election were pretty close, not as close as people thought they might be, but they were still pretty close, that we've got a very divided country. And we know this, but we keep thinking it's divided in terms of Congress or in terms of our leaders. It's also very divided in public opinion, and particularly when we talk about issues. And so when we go through here, we ask, for example, immigrants, do you agree or disagree? Immigrants are generally good for the American economy. Many, many more of the people who expressed support for Barack Obama agree with that or strongly agree with that than the numbers that strongly agree or agree among the Romney supporters. And then when we turn to
Especially the spread between the strongly agree.
Yeah, so strongly's agrees that
Somewhat
are really...
agrees.
Somewhat agrees, middle of road types, but you've got a good chunk out there, over a third, as you say, of those who support Barack Obama strongly agree with that statement, and it's just under 20% of the Romney supporters. So even if we see the Republican Party at the top saying, yes, we need immigration reform and they're going to be good for the economy, they've got the job of convincing their supporters. So they have to, and they may have political motivations for doing this, because that's the general critique right now for the Republican Party, is they have to figure out how to attract Hispanic voters. But the way they're going to have to do that is convincing their base about issues like the contribution that these immigrants, that all immigrants are making.
That's a whole other conversation. Was that always there, or just is that a recent development at the base, or is it, is it something that's been brewing for? That's a
and
because it wasn't something that was a part of the previous administrations.
Right.
And when I say that, I mean, more than 4 years ago.
Right. And that's one of the things that we hope when we talk about some future research that we'd like to explore. But we've got a couple other, and again, these are up on the website. Immigrants make America more open to new ideas and cultures. Again, it's a strongly agrees where you see that big difference, where it's not quite twice as many Obama supporters, but a significantly larger share compared to the supporters for Mitt Romney.
Yeah, the somewhat agree is pretty close.
Yeah, the somewhat agrees are pretty close. Immigrants increase crime rates. All right, you're still finding, close to 40% of the Romney supporters feel that way, and just over 20% of the Obama supporters. So there are differences in perceptions. The last one is one that, do you agree or disagree? Additional physical barriers such as fences or walls should be constructed along the U.S.-Mexican border. When we look at the Romney supporters, it's over 80%. All right, and if you look at the Obama supporters even, it's over 40%. So there are some issues where education is needed and where people in the public need to understand.
I mean, really 2 words, talking points. I mean, the effect of, that rhetoric on both sides.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people don't understand in the public right now is the influx of immigrants, legal, illegal, whatever, from Mexico is zero right now. There are no new, there are a lot of Mexicans going back. Okay, there isn't an increase in the Mexican population right now, and it hasn't been for a number of years. And it probably doesn't have much to do with enforcement. Actually, in my class last night, we invited a person from ICE to come talk to her, because we're doing a class on immigration research. And it was interesting to have him come in and talk to the class about the situation on the ground. And that was one of the first things he said. And he said it's not enforcement they'll take credit for it. Okay, it's really the economy. I think one of the things, I've talked to people at the Mexican consulate, one of the things they say is if America does not get on board with some things like the DREAM Act, they'll be happy to have those kids back in Mexico. So here, that they're ambitious, they're smart, they've got a good American education, and if they're being denied opportunities in the U.S., then there are opportunities elsewhere. And I think that's one of the issues that we have to really think about for immigration reform. That we're part of a global economy, and there's talent, and there's a demand for talent, and you go talk to the people who are in high-tech fields, and they can't get the engineers, the computer programmers, the analysts, the business analysts that they need. There was an event recently at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce where they brought in some immigrant entrepreneurs. And the gentleman, I forget his name, who's the CEO of Cognizant, who currently has 140,000 employees and is an immigrant. And he's, I would guess, early 40s, if that. And he says he constantly has about 500 openings for skilled PhD level computer scientists, software engineers, business analysts. And if we're not going to allow people of that caliber in terms of education and skills to work in the United States, they're going to find jobs elsewhere.
Right.
You know, and I think that's something that we really have to wake up. The policymakers, I think, are understanding that, but the public has to understand it as well, you know, because that's who the policymakers are dependent on to keep their jobs.
Because a lot of the countries that these workers are coming from are actually, their economies are doing well.
Yeah.
You know, they're growing leaps and bounds. So,
right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, we have another small project we're working on about, it's with a group of sociologists at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And they did an initial survey on freelance online workers and looking at the people who are doing primarily IT type work through markets set up through internet sites where people can connect with one another, buyers and sellers, for high skill employment. And we've done something similar in the United States. And the important thing for people to realize is, if you're going to talk about our jobs, which is again this rhetoric, a lot of our jobs are being outsourced right now through not just the outsourcing companies, but through brokering agencies where people can, like freelance.com, where people can then connect with directly, you know, leave out the middle person, and people can buy and sell high skill services through these websites. And a lot of work is being done in places like India, China, Pakistan, the former Soviet Union, where people are doing work for American companies, but not crossing borders. You know, and I think one of the things that we've gotten very fixated on in the discussion about immigrants in the U.S. is this idea of a physical border, and immigration is about bodies crossing borders. You know, in our global society today, it's very, very different. A lot of it's information crossing borders. You know, and I think this is where my interest in technology ties very closely to this. Because I think one of the other important things, as we go beyond the idea of the economic contribution of immigrants, that we begin to think about the way that the entire process of assimilation and adaptation may be changing through technology. You know, the ability to stay in touch with your country of origin and to sort of have at least a mental home in multiple places has, you know, it was always there, but you had to wait 6 weeks for the letter to arrive. You know, here you can turn on Skype. I have a guy who, colleague I met in Pakistan, and he's at University in Bannu, up in the Northwest province. And you know, it's the middle of nowhere. You know, it's a very small university, very traditional culture, a lot of sheep herding. And he and I Skype. You know, that he can just, you know, we can have a conversation, you know, 12 hours apart, time zone wise, but seamless communication. And I think the way that ideas and information are spreading is going to completely change the immigration experience. You know, and I think that's something that we have to figure into this idea of immigration reform. So the last thing I'll mention is a couple things that we're thinking about for the future, and then I'd like some additional questions or ideas you have about what we should be looking at the new Institute for Immigration Research. We're going to be doing, as part of our sort of political outreach, we're going to be putting together some state-level fact sheets And there's some out there already. The Migration Policy Institute has a great collection of these, and we're going to work with some of their data and then adding in ours with a real focus on, a single page, how are immigrants contributing to the economy in each particular state. And here I should give a public acknowledgement to our great graduate students that we're funding through the Institute for Immigration Research, who've produced a lot of the ground level detail and data here. They've been doing a good job, and will help with the fact sheets as well. We're also going to work on a survey of attitudes, and this would be a nationwide telephone survey of attitudes toward and knowledge of the economic contribution that immigrants are making. One project that's moving away from this particular topic and is going to we're going to be looking for additional funding sources, is building a consortium of groups like the Rumi Forum and other either ethnic or nationally oriented immigrant groups, and try to get together with them to do a large-scale series of interviews in the DC metropolitan area, and to be able to look at economic contributions, also integration issues. And what I'm hoping is that working with groups like the Rumi Forum, that will help us get access to the community, support in the community. One of the real limitations that we're finding in this sort of assessing the contribution of the economic impact of these foreign-born workers is data quality. Right. And the Census Bureau knows it, that they're undercounting every immigrant group. They're asking questions in ways that may not be culturally appropriate. Right. And they're working, they take this very seriously, but it's a huge task. Yeah. And if we can work with some of these groups that are in the area, that have access to the community that we as outside researchers don't have, that will allow us to get higher quality data on the variety of immigrant groups that are here in the DC metropolitan area.
Absolutely. I mean, because there's a trust factor there, right? And people that maybe aren't partaking because they're concerned about other things. So it's very important.
Yeah, no, we're reaching out to different communities to try to build that consortium, because we think it's really important if we're really going to have, and I think one of the limitations of the discussion about immigration and immigration reform is it has not been data driven. And if we're going to do it that way, then we need higher quality data. And we need to work with the different immigrant groups to get that data, and it's going to be the advantage not just of the immigrant groups, but the U.S. and the country as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So,
all right. Well,
questions, suggestions?
Yes.
What should we do differently?
First question, comment. Yes, Pam.
Hello. Is this on?
Say yes. So
okay.
Yes. Yep, it's on.
Okay. I was just wondering if it would be helpful to break out undocumented immigrants and immigrants in some of the data on these maps, and even in some of the questions on the surveys, because I think people have very different attitudes if they know someone's on. And sometimes too, I think when you talk of immigrants, people think it's code for Mexicans,
right?
And they don't see all the other groups. So I was just wondering, what about that question?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's a real hot potato. What we found in just working on this survey project, the election project that I told you about, independently, we saw it as a way to get some interesting data. We also used it as a teaching tool. And we had our graduate students working on the questions. We had a lot of our undergraduates actually making the phone calls. And you wouldn't believe, at both universities, the amount of discussion. We had a question about the DREAM Act and whether we should refer to the potential recipients of benefits of the DREAM Act as illegal, unauthorized, or undocumented. And there was a lot of discussion among the students, and then when we actually made the phone calls, we ended up using the word illegal. But that was in part because I had written a op-ed piece that was in the Richmond paper. It was again part of our trying to reach out to people, and this was over the summer right after the All-Star baseball game. Over 28% of the professional baseball players today are immigrants. 23% of the roster for the All-Star game were immigrants.
Wow.
And in that op-ed piece, I used the word undocumented, and there were more comments about the political correctness of that term and challenging the use of that term than the actual content of the story. So it's, and I think you're absolutely right, but I think this gets back to that issue of trust.
Yeah.
That if I walk up to someone and, white guy from the Midwest and say, are you legal, here legally or illegally? What am I going to think? Of course I'm here legally. And so I've got as bad a data as I have right now. If instead we've got a trusted broker, somebody who's worked in the community, and they know you're not going to run back to ICE and say, hey, I found somebody, that we'll get much higher quality data. And that's what we need to do. But it is an important distinction.
It's an interesting dynamic. I imagine that ICE knows that will be done and that research, but at the same time, knowing that research is necessary for even the work that they do.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And
it's an interesting dynamic there.
It was interesting last night when we had again this ICE representative in my class, and he sort of knew he was going into kind of hostile territory, or that he was going to get hard questions. And he answered very, very professionally. And really his line was, if people want things done differently, then change the policies or change the law. And that they'll be happy to enforce a different set of policies and laws, but it has to happen through the political process. Otherwise, it's his job to do what the law tells him to do.
It's very important for all sides to understand one another, and he has a job to do.
Right.
And so, yes.
Yes, sir.
You want me to go without
Umit? No, he's coming.
Thank you. Sorry that I didn't get your entire presentation. I hope there were more people here. I guess you're not Hispanic, otherwise you could have collected a lot more people. I mean, those of us who are legal immigrants for a long time, and I hate to use that term because I don't think that should be a basis, we feel that America has lost the spirit of Emma Lazarus's big slogan, on the Statue of Liberty, which when I came in 1968, 69, we were told, this is America,
Right.
And I looked at it and I wondered, that they're going to take all the hungry, starving,
Right.
and undesirables from every country and make them Rockefeller golden.
Yeah.
Said, great. And that's very noble. Coming from India, I thought that was a great noble. But that spirit is lost and gone. Given that, we need to educate all the, I would call them fascists in America, that they've got to change their attitude if they really want a good, noble country, and we've got to stop going to unnecessary wars too.
Right.
Given that situation, I don't know what exactly your plan is. I think one of the plans should be to educate those right-wing Americans, like you said in Chicago, you asked the guy, and some of their ancestors were illegal, you remember?
Right.
When the American Indians owned this country, they came in all illegally killing and usurping their land, so obviously they were all illegal, and as you come down. So given that, I think we need to get Americans to believe in Emma Lazarus's statement, otherwise get rid of it.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it is, one of the things that we've been talking about, and is going to be a focus of the Institute for Immigration Research, is changing public opinion and getting those stories out there, letting people know. And narrowly to begin with, it's about the economic contributions, but more broadly, the social contributions, the things that are happening in our communities through Korean churches. Okay, the sort of social entrepreneurship that is revitalizing on an ongoing basis. Not just today, that's been the story, as you say, of immigration in the past. And for some reason, at this moment, and maybe we're at a tipping point, that at this moment people are associating very negative things with immigrants and not recognizing the benefits. One of the, I didn't touch on it much, but we're also working on a series of very short, there'll probably be 2 versions, one 4 pages, one 1 page. And some of it will be physical paper stuff and also will be on the website. And the title of it is Immigrants Working for Us, for US. And so we're starting with the pharmaceutical industry, where 20% of Americans pharmacists were not born in the United States. As we're all aging, but there's a particular cohort of us, the baby boomers, that's very large. And the demand for people to provide pharmaceutical services, medical services, is going to be increasing dramatically. And if we didn't have that immigrant group providing those sorts of services for us, I had to get a prescription. I had to go to a doctor last week, and the doctor was from Cameroon. And then I went and got the prescription filled, and the 2 pharmacists, one was from Vietnam and the other one was from China. That without the immigrant contributions in particular sectors, we would be in trouble. And I think that's one of the ways, one of the things we've been talking a lot about at the Institute is that the big data sets we're using are important. Okay, that they are, especially as we get higher quality data, but really to move the bar when it comes to public opinion and even policymakers, we need some personal stories. We need to be able to say, this is in a very concrete way for you, the way that immigrants really deserve to be welcomed. And that's quite a part, you're also right, we should be welcoming everyone, but getting people to understand it's in their interest.
Yeah, and I think this is the big thing, in a nonpartisan, fact-giving, and possibly, having these personal stories being told, but in a way, but not being, if you're someone who, well, yes, we're a land of immigrants and everybody should be allowed here. We should open our arms. Well, the truth is not a lot of people, or there are some, a lot of people that don't believe that. And we still need to be able to make that case, in that way, and we should.
Yeah.
It's important, for this.
Yeah, and I think there's a need, and this goes well beyond the topic of immigration reform, but I think one of the things that America really begins to need to begin thinking about is how to move beyond sort of a zero-sum mentality. If I'd highly recommend, there's a series of interviews with Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, and it's John Battelle, who's a Wired guy, and he does regular tech talks. You can find these on YouTube. And he interviewed his most recent one, and he's been following, about once a year he interviews Zuckerberg. And in the most recent one, they talk about the zero-sum game. And it comes up where Battelle says to Zuckerberg, are you worried about competitors? And are you worried about the ideas that you're giving to other people and the people who are using your platform for their own purposes? And he looked at him like he was from another planet. He said, of course not. I mean, as that grows, as they begin to develop new uses for technology, I win. That it's not, particularly with some of these new forms of technology, we have to get over the idea of a pie that has one size. And the important thing is the zero-sum game mentality fits very well when most things of value are physical materials, things that really are limited in quantity. But things like information and intelligence, entertainment, those are things that don't fit into a container, that they can expand well beyond where they are right now. And those can then be used to make what we get out of physical limitations much more efficient. One great example here is 3D printing. Anybody ever know about 3D printing? 3D printing is it's being used in industry right now. It's a type of, where you print things like an inkjet printer, but it builds things up. And so you can make small-scale models. You can, I recently talked to someone who was, they were printing buildings, where they had large concrete pouring devices between telephone poles, and able to pour the concrete very precisely. And the thing about 3D printing as an approach to manufacturing is it's zero waste. The old style of manufacturing, you had a block of something and you cut away to get the shape you want, and all of that's trash, the things that you cut away. Here, because of, again, this is a change in manufacturing driven by information, that you build things up instead, and you only use that material that's going to be of value to the final product. And so those sorts of changes I think we can take advantage of.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Well, we have one more. Yep, absolutely.
One last question.
We can do that. Yep.
My name's Rachel Hansen, and my question is, well, it's a question and it's not a suggestion. But I'm asking sort of from my own recent experience of teaching English abroad and thinking about this constant complaint also that's just part of the kind of public attitude about immigration, that like all these immigrants are coming here and they don't speak English. And pretty soon the United States is going to be a Spanish-speaking country. And so I'm wondering if there's any research out there that's kind of looking at this huge expansion of English instruction that's happened over the last decade maybe, or 5 years, I don't know exactly how long, but if we're seeing any change in the level of English ability of immigrants as a result of like all of the 20-something Americans that are going abroad to teach English.
I don't know. That's a good question, though, and I think it really is worth looking at. And it's a way of sort of spreading, and it may make America a more attractive destination, and preparing people in advance to come here. But I think it's important, just as it's very important that more Americans go do what you did, go out and live in another culture. Probably learned a little bit of another language, or maybe a lot of another language, and sort of understand what the world is like, because we're living in this global environment. When I taught at Clemson, the president there had this great suggestion, which they never implemented, but I thought it was very good, was that when a student applied, they had to do the normal application process, and they should also include their passport application. To really sort of say, it's important for us not just to be here, but to welcome people here, but then also go out and see the world ourselves and explore that.
Well, and to want the world to be, I mean, do we want to be the only country in the world that has the highest level of thinking, that has the highest level of education, that has, do we want to be the only one, or do we want this to, the love to spread, for example, or, compete in good works,
Right.
for example. Do we want other countries to benefit? Because we benefit ultimately,
Right.
if that spreads.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, getting away from the zero-sum thinking,
Right.
and also that competition can be seen either as winners and losers, or competition can be seen as a way to make everybody better.
Right.
And I think that's the non-zero-sum approach
Right.
to it.
On that note, we will end this, and I just want to say for our viewing and listening audience that I'll go ahead and put the link on our website under where we have the links for the podcast and YouTube for your talk. We'll also put a link to the website and information to contact.
Yes, we'd like to hear from people.
Super. All right. Thank you all for joining us today, and to our viewing audience, thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.